Good morning and welcome. We're in session 15 of The Historical Jesus by E.P. Sanders. In session 14 last week, we had a look at the three symbolic actions by Jesus in his last week. This include coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, declaring himself to be some type of king by the symbolism. Secondly, the turning of the tables in the temple in Jerusalem, which seems to be an indication not necessarily of a type of reform for the temple, but a prediction of some type of destruction. And then lastly, we had a look at the symbolism of the Last Supper, which seems to be Jesus symbolizing that the kingdom of God was there soon, and that he would not eat and drink again, or at least not drink again, until it is there, and then he will drink with his disciples in it. So these three symbolic actions characterize what is commonly called the last week of Jesus' life. Now, today we want to move on in session 15 to Jesus' arrest, the recommendation to execute him, and have a look at Pilate's decision, and then the final, just a couple of thoughts on the execution of Jesus. All right, so let's jump straight into this today. Jesus' arrest. So the simple questions here are, why did the high priest arrest Jesus? Most immediately, it seems like the cause of Jesus' arrest was a prophetic declaration and demonstration in the temple. At least he thought that he had threatened it. So at least it seems like at least the high priest thought that Jesus had threatened the temple. The temple action kind of seals his faith then in this sense. So Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, Mark has the high priest seem to be at least aware of his proclamation as king, and also then the threat against the temple. Ultimately, the high priest wanted him dead because he might cause trouble in Jerusalem during this very volatile time, the time of the Passover. The high priest was responsible for good order in Judea. He reported to the Roman governor of that area, Pilate at this stage. He's also called the prefect, but he is responsible for the Jewish side of things. And if things get out of hand, he'll get in trouble with Pilate. And as we'll see a little bit later, Pilate was quite a vicious character. So, EP here says that Jesus was not a madman, right? And he was potentially dangerous for the stability of Jerusalem. And this seems to be the reason why the high priest had him arrested. There are two other theories of why Jesus was arrested. The first one is that he was completely misunderstood. In other words, they thought he was going to raise an army and fight the Romans, right? And executed him then because he was a rebel in that sense, a real political and military threat. But the fact that they went after none of his followers tells us something. It tells us that they kind of understood Jesus and his followers well. He might rouse a mob, but he's not going to get an army together. And so one of the arguments here is that Jesus' followers are actually left alone completely, and he's the only one executed. It means they understood Jesus' movement as the movement of not a political military threat, but really just Jesus' radical Jewish views or religious views might cause a mob maybe together, but it's not organized military action. And that's the reason they didn't go after his followers. And EP, seems like, motivates this to say that Jesus wasn't misunderstood. That's not the reason he was arrested. So the second other theory is that the theological differences between Jesus and the Pharisees was the reason that he was arrested. This seems to be the reason I grew up with. And in my mind, at least, Jesus was arrested because he didn't wash his hands before meals, and he allowed his disciples to walk and eat and gather wheat on the Sabbath. And all the disagreements with the Pharisees, what eventually they said, well, we've got to kill him. Now, you might recall in one of the earlier parts of this series, we had a look at the disagreements with the Pharisees, and we actually benchmarked them against typical disagreements that would have been had between other factions of the Jewish community. And we realize that the differences between the altercations between Jesus and the Pharisees are nothing extraordinary. They're nothing special for that time. And we concluded there, EP concludes, and I agree, is that there's no reason for them to kill him after those interactions, although that's what Mark wants us to believe. Mark escalates a quick succession of 5 conflict stories that end in, we want to kill him, the Pharisees, that is. So, EP marks here, he says, Jews did not kill each other based on the type of differences that Jesus actually had with the Pharisees. Pharisees are almost entirely absent from the last chapters of the gospel and completely absent from his arrest and his trial. This is important information that the gospel themselves gives us. The high priest and chief priests are the primary actors. So I think that what he's trying to say here is that the differences between Jesus and the Pharisees could not reasonably have been a cause for the arrest of Jesus. So what's the conclusion from this? The theory that Caiaphas, the residing high priest, had Jesus arrested because of his responsibility to put down troublemakers, especially during festivals, corresponds well with all the evidence we have. Caiaphas was primarily concerned with Jesus causing a religious type of a riot, arresting him, and he then recommends execution when he brings him before Pilate. Pilate, as we know, promptly complies to the request. All right, so let's say a little bit more about the recommendation to execute. Why did they want him executed? Why did Caiaphas and his council recommend execution to Pilate? The trial scenes in Mark, Matthew, and Luke provide possible answers, but they're quite limited. We know, of course, and we have to keep in mind that Mark is actually the source for Matthew and Luke. The short form in Mark and Matthew has the chief priests, elders, and scribe consulting together, after which they bound Jesus and they led him to Pilate. The second trial narrative describes an interrogation in which witnesses are brought, and they are witnesses that say that Jesus threatened the temple. But their testimonies don't agree. So the high priest then moves on to plan B, which is asking Jesus, are you Messiah, Son of the Blessed? So we understand this to be a question that in that time would have meant, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, yes. In Matthew, he says, you say so, but I say. In Mark and Matthew, then Jesus predicts the coming of the Son of Man after this question is asked. And you will see the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory, etc., etc. It's at this point that the high priest rents his garments, which is actually an illegal action as far as I understand by the law. The priest is not supposed to rent his garments, but this adds, gravitas to what's going on. The high priest is saying, no more, this is the end, I can't handle anymore, we have to execute him. And he then declares the big B word, blasphemy. Now, Luke offers a slightly different account. As far as we know, just on the side, when Luke starts his account in the Gospel of Luke, he starts it more like a historian writing. Someone that, he says there, I've done my homework, I've interviewed, I've spoken to people who've spoken to people, and I'm writing a better account than those who were written before me. So it seems to be that Luke is often trying to be more historical in his approach. More historical than who? Who are the people that wrote before him? We're not sure who he was using, besides we know that he used Mark, but there are scholars today that are saying that Luke probably used Matthew as well. But anyway, that's on the side. Now, in Luke, the account is slightly different. There's only one trial. It happens by interrogators asking Jesus if he was the Christ. He offers an evasive answer, and he adds that from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God with power. Only then do the interrogators go on and ask him if he is the Son of God. And to that he replies, you say that I am. Luke does not use the word blasphemy at all, but the judges need no more testimony. They've heard it from his own lips. Now, in the decades, some perspective, in the decades after the life of Jesus, Christians would claim titles for Jesus. It doesn't seem like Jesus claimed titles for himself. He didn't use titles. He was under pressure. He would often acknowledge titles, but he didn't go around claiming titles. Now, it seems that later Christians would claim titles for Jesus. For instance, Messiah, Son of God. And they would interpret them in ways that would have been considered blasphemous to the Jews. Jesus was not a mere mortal, is what they were trying to say. But this seems to be a Christian combination and achievement. Titles play such a small role in the synoptics that we must doubt that they were a real issue at the trial. This is the conclusion of EP. So, possibly Jesus' threat to the temple was the real issue, and that was the charge. The witnesses messed up, but the high priest had already made up his mind, and he called it blasphemy. And once he tore his clothes, an action which very rarely happened, he was kind of getting everyone on the same bandwagon. He's like, I've had enough. No more witnessing, no further inquiry. This man is guilty of blasphemy. He tore his garment, and in that sense, he almost vetoed any argument against it. So, EP says here, he proposes two views on the trial. So let's start with Mark's own view. So this is the view according to what we understand Mark believed, and that's based on the Gospel of Mark. Right. Jesus did not claim titles for himself during his ministry, and he tried to silence those who did. Therefore, titles do not really account for his arrest. But Caiaphas had Jesus arrested because he threatened the temple in some way. Jesus did not actually threaten the temple, so that it was a mistrial. But the high priest, however, asked leading questions about titles, which Jesus accepted as applying to himself. And the high priest then vetoes everybody, calls blasphemy, and has Jesus taken to Pilate on recommendation of execution. Now, there's another view to this, and this is the critical interpretation of Mark. In other words, this is historians stepping back from Mark, realizing that Mark himself is giving us what he believes. So stepping back and looking at Mark's perspective, the one we've just mentioned, more critically, and seeing if there's gold gaps or holes that needs further attention. So, the critical interpretation of Mark on the trial of Jesus looks something like this for E.P. Sanders. Mark attaches to Messiah and Son of God meanings blasphemous only as understood later, meanings they did not have before the church's Christology appears. Here it is. And here it is. All right, there's 8 points here. Number 1, Jesus did not give himself titles, and when directly asked, he mostly declined. Jesus was arrested because he threatened the temple. When the witnesses failed to agree, Caiaphas did not release Jesus. He tried again, showing his intent on judgment from the very beginning. He asked Jesus if he was Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said that he was. These titles did not, in their contextual environment, necessarily constitute blasphemy. The high priest decided to call blasphemy anyway because of his predetermination. Instead of further inquiry, then, Caiaphas made an extravagant display of mourning, tearing his robes, persuading his counselors to join him in the condemnation. Thus, the titles were an expedient way to find Jesus guilty of being a threat to the temple, which was the immediate cause of his execution. This was Caiaphas's political responsibility. He had to preserve the peace in Jerusalem during the festivals. And so, because he thought that Jesus was a threat to the temple, that he might cause a riot, he went to whatever extent he needed to go, resorting to titles and calling of blasphemy and the tearing of his robe, although his initial inquiry was really against Jesus' threat or supposed threat to the temple. Okay, now let's move on to Pilate. Now, Pilate's an interesting character because, as historians note, Pilate's character in the Gospels, as time progresses, it changes slightly. But what helps us here a lot is we actually have external evidence and writings on Pilate. We have Flavius Josephus, the notorious, or not notorious, the well-known Jewish historian of the first century. We also have Philo of Alexandria, who was a Hellenized Jew from Alexandria in Egypt. And he also wrote a little bit of historical account, but in this case specifically, which interests us, is that he wrote about Pilate. So we have some references, historical, external evidence for what Pilate was actually like. Now, I want to say in advance, maybe before we look at this, that it seems to historians, and it seems likely to me as well as I've looked at it, that this Pilate seemed to develop into a more caring and concerning character the further we go in the Gospels. In other words, in progress from Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then eventually into John. To the point that he is not sure if he should execute Jesus. He kind of finds him innocent, but continues to execute him on the request of the Jewish mob. Which doesn't line up very well with the character of Pilate, who actually eventually lost his position because of indiscriminate executions. He was violent, he was fraudulent, and he was merciless. And the idea that a Jewish mob would convince him to execute or not execute seems improbable when looking at all the historical evidence. It seems much more probable that later Christians, because they became more and more Gentile in their composition, they would like to get the favor of Rome, and they also started painting the Jews as their real opposition in the first century. So that by the time we get to Matthew, Luke, and John, progressively Pilate becomes more innocent in the execution of Jesus. That's the favor of Rome. And the Jews become more complicit. This is a trend you could pick up if you go and read these portions for yourself. Look specifically at the words of Pilate in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and in John, and you'll see the progression. Okay, let's get back to the book. Why did Pilate execute Jesus? Pilate's not concerned with Jewish claims of Messiah. Messiah means nothing to a Roman governor. It doesn't mean anything. Would he execute him based on religious claims? Most probably not. So what is the reason that Pilate so swiftly, and I mean swiftly, declared the execution of Jesus without any real further trial? Well, Pilate ordered the execution because the high priest recommended it. And he gave him a very good reason. And this reason is actually one that's historically well attested. Jesus claimed to be king of the Jews. Pilate understood that Jesus did not want to raise an army, and therefore he didn't really go after his followers like a true insurrectionist. But Jesus' religious fanaticism definitely posed a threat to law and order in Jerusalem. The Gospels of Matthew and John especially wants Jesus to be condemned by the Jewish mob and against Pilate's better judgment. Pilate worried in Matthew, warned by his wife. He consults the crowd on Jesus' behalf before finally, unable to withstand the clamor of the crowd, he has Jesus executed. Now, this is historically rather unlikely. The reason is that these elements derive from the desire of Christians to get along with Rome later on and to depict Jews as their real opponents. Recall, the Christian movement was a Jewish movement with this particular claim. Jesus is the Messiah because God resurrected him from the dead. But as time progressed, the Jews did not accept this claim, and they started not excommunicating, but obviously they started persecuting and excommunicating in a very informal sense, I guess, Jews, Christian Jews from the synagogues and possibly even from their families and their communities. So that by the time we get to John, there's a strong anti-Jewish sentiment in the Gospel of John. And by the time we get to Revelation, synagogues are called the synagogue of Satan. And so the Christian movement seems to progressively separate itself from its Jewish roots. And as we very well know, Christians became notorious in later centuries for the persecution of Jews. Okay, so Philo of Alexandria was a contemporary of Pilate, of course, and he, in a letter he writes to Emperor Gaius, or Caligula, he includes a description of Pilate: robberies, insults, robberies, executions without trial, and the ceaseless and supremely, executions without trial and ceaseless grievous accounts. Cruelty marked Pilate's rule. Pilate was eventually dismissed because of large-scale, ill-judged executions. This information agrees with the Gospels. Jesus appeared before him, and he was almost immediately executed without further witness and trial. Stories about Pilate's reluctance or his weakness of will has to be understood as Christian polemics. In other words, Christian redefining realities later. They reduced the conflict between Rome's authority and the Christian movement by progressively painting Pilate as someone who didn't want to execute Jesus, and also then, as I said earlier, progressively later on depicting the Jews as their real enemy or opponents. Okay, now finally, the execution of Jesus. Early on Friday, 15 Nisan, Jesus and two others were taken outside the city walls, nailed to a cross, and they were left to die. Only a few brave followers watched, right? A distant admirer, Joseph of Arimathea, donated a grave in which Jesus was buried. So who was actually there at the crucifixion? Well, we have accounts of women being present at a distance, right? So there's nobody actually immediately around the cross to hear his words or communicate with him. But the real question for me is, where are the disciples? Where are these guys that pledged their life? They are gone. These oaks are disappeared. Since the time that Jesus was arrested, all of them ran. Peter hung around for a little bit, denied him 3 times, and he bolted. So by the time Jesus hangs on the cross, there's nobody there. Possibly his mom and some other women are standing at a long distance, but there's no one surrounding the cross. There's no emotional support. He's deserted by everyone. And as we see in the account in Mark, he also feels deserted by God at this point. So, in the Gospels, there are allusions to Psalm 22 that can be found in the accounts. Ideas like they divided his clothes, casting lots for them, wagging their heads, and Jesus' exclamation in Mark, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, as is the real dilemma with these inclusion of almost direct quotes from old Psalms, is that they can be seen in 2 ways. You can think of it as Jesus using these words because he knew them, he knew the Psalms, and prophetically uttering these words while he is on the cross. The problem with that is just we're struggling to find or think about who would actually recorded these words, because none of his followers were close by at all. So we don't know, did Luke look up the centurion, the Roman centurion, 60 years later, who was around the cross? It just seems unlikely. It seems much more likely that later writers, not knowing what Jesus would have said and what would have happened because they were absent, using prophetic psalms to fill in the blanks. Now, we know that Matthew is notorious for this, and in one particular account, the birth story of Jesus in the book of Matthew seems to be built upon earlier prophetic writings. As usual, in these circumstances, we don't really know then whether these things really took place. I mean, I don't mean the crucifixion. I mean, did people wag their heads? Did they divide his clothes, casting lots? Did Jesus really say, my God, why have you forsaken me? We can't say. It's not possible to historically verify. The synoptics and John also differ much on these elements, and that makes it even harder for us, because if they all just agreed and gave us the same information, we could say this is probable that it's historical because we have independent sources. We don't have that. The sources we do have don't agree. So it doesn't make our task any easier. So EP says this. He says, our guess is that Jesus' cry was his own reminiscence of the psalm, not just a motive inserted later. And this cry, of course, is, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's also recorded in the Aramaic language, as far as I understand, which means it tends to seem to be something that was original to Jesus. EP also further argues that on the criteria of embarrassment, it was most probably something that Jesus could have said. And the criteria of embarrassment works like this. It's an embarrassing thing to record Jesus to say something like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because that doesn't line up well with Trinitarian thought, or with the idea that Jesus was 100% God, but yet it's still in there. And so it's by the criteria of embarrassment that we think, well, it wouldn't have been created by later Christian writers, so it most probably comes from a very early source, and possibly goes back to Jesus himself. So why would Jesus have felt then so deserted during his execution? Now, of course, if you're wondering why I'm only busy with Mark here, it's just simply because if we follow Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, there also seems to be a progression during later times as Christian writers record the execution of Jesus. Jesus becomes more in control, more prophetic, he talks more, he forgives people, he calls his own death. He never says, God, why have you forsaken me? And so it seems like Mark looks a little bit more, it's definitely an earlier source used by two of the other Gospels, and seems a little bit more authentic to us. So the question then is, as we find in Mark, why would Jesus feel deserted while he is hanging on the cross? Or possibly when Jesus predicted himself drinking in the kingdom, he wasn't talking about 2026, but I was actually expecting it imminently, as Jesus' writings, or just Jesus' message, and even a later Paul predicts that it's absolutely imminent. Possibly even early enough to prevent his death. In other words, there's a possibility that Jesus believed when he was standing in front of the high priest and they condemned him to death. And when he then said, but you'll see the Son of Man coming, he says, you will. That he expected this intervention of the Son of Man even before his death. And so hanging on the cross, being arrested, condemned, he felt deserted because it hadn't happened yet. So this cry, my God, why have you forsaken me, could be a real, genuine call of despair and a feeling of being forsaken. But this is only one explanation, and we do not know what he really thought in that moment of agony. After a short period of suffering, we know that he died. Some of his followers and his sympathizers took the body and buried him, according to the Gospels. Right, so that's it for the execution and trial of Jesus. In our next session, we're going to move on to the resurrection. We want to talk about the different resurrection appearances. Who says what? The type of resurrection the Gospels speak of, and what it is we can take away from this. Thanks for listening. See you next time.